The shadows of the mountains stretched long across the small town of Wallace, Idaho, as Flora Newson pressed her forehead against the cool glass of her bedroom window, watching her husband's carriage disappear down the dusty road. Each day that Harold Newson left for business was a brief respite from the coldness that had come to define her marriage, but even these moments of solitude felt like another form of prison. The year was 1878, and at 22 years old, Flora had already resigned herself to a lifetime of quiet desperation in a loveless union she'd never wanted. Flora pulled away from the window and caught a glimpse of herself in the ornate mirror that hung on the wall, a wedding gift from Harold's mother. Her auburn hair was neatly pinned, her green eyes dull with the resignation that had slowly replaced the spark of life she once possessed. 3 years of marriage to a man 20 years, her senior, had taught her that some cages had no visible bars. "Mrs. Newson," called Martha, the housekeeper, from downstairs. "Will you be taking tea in the parlor?" Flora sighed. Another day of the same routine stretched before her. "Yes, Martha." "Thank you." She smoothed her pale blue dress and descended the grand staircase of the home that felt more like a mausoleum than a residence. Harold Newson was one of the wealthiest men in Wallace, a silver mining investor who had built his fortune on the backs of desperate men. He had chosen Flora as one might select a decorative vase, something pretty to possess, to display at social gatherings, and then ignore. Their marriage had been her father's final transaction before his death, his mining debts forgiven in exchange for his only daughter's hand. Flora had been 19, frightened, and powerless to refuse. The parlor was immaculate as always, with heavy velvet curtains and furniture that was meant to be admired rather than used. Flora sat stiffly on the edge of a chair as Martha brought in the tea service. "Will Mr. Newson be home for dinner?" Martha asked, though they both knew the answer. "Not until tomorrow evening. He's meeting with investors in Coeur d'Alene." Martha nodded and left, closing the door behind her. The silence in the house seemed to press in from all sides. Flora's hand trembled slightly as she lifted the teacup to her lips. She thought of the letters hidden beneath the loose floorboard under her bed, replies from her cousin in Boston that Harold must never find. 3 times she had written asking for help, for a place to escape to. 3 times the answer had been the same. Her cousin's husband would not permit it. There was nowhere to go, no one to turn to. In the eyes of the law and society, she was Harold Newson's property, as surely as the silver mines that made him wealthy. Flora placed the teacup back on its saucer with a soft clink and made a decision. She would at least walk into town today. Harold discouraged her from going out alone. He claimed it wasn't proper for a lady of her standing, but she needed to feel the sun on her face, to remember there was a world beyond these walls. She dressed simply, choosing her least ostentatious bonnet and a shawl to ward off the spring chill. As she slipped out the front door, she nodded politely to Mr. Peterson, Harold's hired man who kept watch over the property when his master was away. She knew he would report her outing to Harold, but she couldn't bring herself to care about the consequences today. The main street of Wallace was bustling with activity. Silver mining had transformed what had once been a small settlement into a growing town. Men in dusty work clothes mingled with businessmen in suits. Women shopped at the general store or gossiped in small groups. Flora walked with her eyes downcast, nodding politely when someone greeted her, but never stopping to chat. Being Mrs. Harold Newson meant living in a strange limbo, respected for her husband's position, but pitied for the same reason. She was passing the telegraph office when the commotion started. A group of horses thundered into town, and at their head rode a man unlike any Flora had seen before. Tall and broad-shouldered, He sat on his horse with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle. His face was tanned from the sun, with laugh lines around his eyes that suggested a life lived fully. Unlike the miners or businessmen of Wallace, there was something untamed about him, something that spoke of wide open spaces and freedom. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, and Flora found herself stopping to watch as he and his companions tied their horses to the hitching post outside the saloon. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the edges of his hat, and as he turned, he caught her staring. For a moment their eyes locked. His were a striking blue, clear as a mountain lake, and they widened slightly as they took her in. Flora felt heat rise to her cheeks and quickly looked away, embarrassed to be caught gawking at a stranger. "Mrs. Newson," the sharp voice of Mrs. Hollister, the banker's wife, broke the moment. "How surprising to see you in town without Mr. Newson. Is everything all right?" Flora forced a smile. "Yes, Mrs. Hollister, just enjoying the fine weather." The older woman's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Well, a lady must be careful. There are all sorts of rough characters passing through these days." Her gaze flicked meaningfully toward the newcomers. "I was just heading back," Flora lied, suddenly eager to escape the woman's scrutiny. As she turned to leave, she couldn't help but glance once more at the stranger. To her surprise, he was still watching her, a curious expression on his face. Something passed between them in that brief look, recognition of a kindred spirit, perhaps. Then Mrs. Hollister cleared her throat pointedly, and Flora hurried away, her heart beating inexplicably faster. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Harold would not return until evening, giving Flora another day of relative freedom. After breakfast, she decided to visit the small bookshop that had recently opened. Reading was one of the few pleasures Harold didn't deny her, though he insisted on approving her selections. The bell above the door jingled as she entered the shop. Mr. Finch, the proprietor, greeted her warmly. "Mrs. Newson, what a pleasure. I've just received some new titles that might interest you." Flora was examining a volume of poetry when the bell jingled again. She glanced up and nearly dropped the book when she saw the stranger from yesterday entering the shop. Up close, he was even more imposing, tall and strong, with a quiet dignity that set him apart from the boisterous miners who frequented the town. Mr. Finch seemed surprised but quickly recovered. "Can I help you, sir?" The man removed his hat, revealing the dark hair Flora had noticed before. "Looking for a book on local geography if you have one. Name's Ethan Sutton." His voice was deep and measured with a slight accent that Flora couldn't place. "Not local, certainly." "For hunting, Mr. Sutton?" asked Mr. Finch. Ethan shook his head. "Cattle drive. Moving a herd north from Oregon. Need to know the best passes through these mountains." "A cowboy," Flora murmured, almost to herself. Both men turned to look at her and she flushed, realizing she'd spoken aloud. Ethan Sutton's mouth curved into a smile that transformed his weathered face. "Yes, madam, though I prefer cattlemen these days. Sounds more respectable." There was a gentle teasing in his tone that Flora found herself responding to instinctively. "And is respectability important to you, Mr. Sutton?" The moment the words left her mouth, she was shocked at her own forwardness. This wasn't how a proper married woman spoke to a stranger, yet something about his presence made her feel bold. His smile deepened, reaching his eyes. "Depends on who's judging, I suppose." Mr. Finch cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I believe I have what you're looking for in the back, Mr. Sutton. If you'll excuse us, Mrs. Newson." As the shopkeeper led Ethan away, Flora tried to compose herself. She shouldn't be having this kind of exchange with an unknown man. If Harold heard of it, and in a town like Wallace, there would be consequences. She quickly selected a book and paid for it, intending to leave before Ethan Sutton returned. But as she reached for the door, his voice stopped her. "Mrs. Newson, is it?" Flora turned, clutching her package. "Yes." He stood a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. Sometimes I forget my manners after too long on the trail." "You didn't," she assured him, surprised by his perception. "I should be getting home, that's all." Ethan nodded. "Of course. But before you go," he hesitated, then continued with a directness that was refreshing after years of Harold's calculated speech. "Is there somewhere good to eat in this town? Somewhere that isn't the saloon? My men and I have been living on trail food for weeks." The question was innocent enough, and Flora found herself answering. "Mrs. Wilson's boarding house serves meals at noon. It's clean and the food is good." "Much obliged." He tipped his head slightly. "Maybe I'll see you around town again, Mrs. Newson." "Perhaps," she replied noncommittally, though the thought sent an unexpected thrill through her. She hurried out the door before she could say anything else inappropriate. As Flora walked home, she couldn't shake the image of Ethan Sutton's smile, or the way his eyes had seemed to see right through her careful facade. It was dangerous to feel this way, this sudden lightness, this awareness. She was a married woman, and he was just passing through. Yet for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Harold returned that evening as expected, bringing with him the usual cloud of tension that settled over the house whenever he was present. Dinner was a formal affair, with Martha serving while Harold spoke at length about his business dealings. Flora responded when required, her thoughts drifting to the encounter at the bookshop. "You're distracted tonight," Harold observed sharply, interrupting his own monologue. Flora straightened in her chair. "Forgive me, I have a slight headache." His eyes narrowed. "Peterson tells me you went into town yesterday and again today." "Yes," she admitted, seeing no point in denying it. "I needed fresh air and a new book." Harold dabbed his mouth with a napkin. "I've told you before, Flora, I don't like you wandering around unaccompanied. It isn't proper." "I was perfectly safe, Harold. Wallace isn't the rough mining camp it once was. Nevertheless, you are my wife. Your behavior reflects on me." He placed his napkin beside his plate with deliberate precision. "I've heard there's a group of cowboys in town. Rough men. I want you to stay home until they've moved on." Flora's heart skipped a beat. Had someone already reported her conversation with Ethan Sutton? "Cowboys are passing through all the time," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "These particular men are driving a large herd north. They'll be camped outside town for at least a week while they resupply." Harold's tone was final. "You will remain at home." Flora stared down at her barely touched dinner. "As you wish." Later that night, as Harold slept beside her, Flora lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The walls of her gilded cage seemed to close in tighter with each passing day. What would it be like, she wondered, to live a life like Ethan Sutton's? To move freely across the country, answering to no one, sleeping beneath the stars. Such thoughts were dangerous, she knew. They led to dissatisfaction, to yearning for things that could never be. Yet as sleep finally claimed her, her dreams were filled with wide open spaces and a pair of clear blue eyes that promised freedom. The next morning, Harold left early for the mines, leaving strict instructions with Peterson to ensure Flora remained at home. She spent the day restlessly pacing from room to room, pausing occasionally to gaze out the windows toward town. It was late afternoon when she heard voices at the front door. Peterson's gruff tone was followed by another that made her freeze in place, deep and calm, with that slight unfamiliar accent. "Ethan Sutton." Flora hurried to the foyer just as Peterson was closing the door. "Who was that?" she asked, though she already knew. Peterson turned, looking uncomfortable. "No one of importance, madam, Just a cowboy asking directions. What directions? She tried to keep her tone casual. To the Sullivan property. Apparently, Mr. Sullivan has agreed to let this Sutton fellow and his men graze their cattle on his lower meadow until they move on. Peterson studied her face. Don't worry, Mrs. Newson. I sent him on his way. Thank you, Peterson, Flora said automatically, her mind racing. The Sullivan property bordered the Newson land to the west, which meant Ethan Sutton and his men would be camped less than a mile from her home. That night, Harold announced he would be leaving again in the morning, this time for several days. There's trouble at the Coeur d'Alene mine, he explained as they sat in the drawing room after dinner. The workers are threatening to strike. I need to deal with it personally. Flora nodded, careful to show neither relief nor interest. Peterson will remain here, of course, Harold continued, watching her closely. And I've asked Mrs. Hollister to call on you. She's concerned about your wandering the town alone. That's thoughtful of her, Flora said, suppressing a grimace. Mrs. Hollister was the worst kind of busybody, eager to report any hint of impropriety back to Harold. I expect you to conduct yourself with appropriate dignity in my absence. His tone hardened. No more unaccompanied trips to town, especially with those cowboys camped so close by. I understand. Harold rose from his chair and approached her, laying a cold hand on her shoulder. You are my wife, Flora. Everything you do reflects on me. I won't tolerate gossip. His fingers tightened painfully for a moment before he released her and left the room. Flora rubbed her shoulder, fighting back tears of frustration and anger. This was her life, a possession to be controlled, a reflection of her husband's status. Nothing more. In that moment, she made a decision that surprised even herself. Tomorrow, when Harold was gone, she would find a way past Peterson. She would go to the Sullivan property and see Ethan Sutton again. Not because of any romantic notion such thoughts were foolish, but because in his presence, she had felt like a person again, not just an extension of Harold Newson. Just once more before he left town forever, she wanted to feel that way again. Dawn broke with a gentle mist rising from the mountains surrounding Wallace. Harold departed early, leaving Flora with a perfunctory kiss on the cheek and a final reminder about staying home. She watched from the window as his carriage disappeared down the drive, then waited another hour to ensure he was truly gone. Peterson would be making his rounds of the property soon. If she was going to leave, it needed to be now. Flora changed quickly into her simplest dress and sturdy boots, pinning her hair beneath a modest bonnet. She slipped downstairs and out through the kitchen garden, keeping to the cover of the trees that lined the property. Once she was certain she wasn't being followed, Flora set off toward the Sullivan meadow. The morning was beautiful, with wildflowers dotting the grass and birds singing in the pines. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of adventure, of breaking free from the suffocating routine of her life. She heard the cattle before she saw them, the low lowing of the herd and the occasional shout of the cowboys keeping watch. Cresting a small hill, she stopped to take in the scene below. Hundreds of cattle grazed in the meadow, with mounted cowboys positioned strategically around them. Near the edge of the field, several wagons were circled, with a cook fire burning and men moving about. And there, emerging from a tent, was Ethan Sutton. Even from a distance, she recognized him immediately. He stood taller than the other men, his movements confident as he spoke to a young cowboy beside him. Flora hesitated, suddenly uncertain. What was she doing here? What would she say? Before she could retreat, Ethan looked up and spotted her standing on the hillside. He stared for a moment, then said something to the young man and started walking in her direction. Flora's heart pounded. She could still turn and run, pretend this had never happened. but her feet remained rooted to the spot as Ethan Sutton climbed the hill toward her. "Mrs. Newson," he said when he reached her, tipping his hat. There was no judgment in his voice, only mild surprise. "This is unexpected. Mr. Sutton." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I heard you were camped here, and you decided to pay a social call." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. Flora felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I was walking and I was curious about your cattle drive." It sounded ridiculous even to her own ears, but Ethan didn't laugh. Instead, he gestured toward the camp. "Would you like to see it? We're just finishing breakfast. I can offer you coffee." Every instinct told her to decline, to return home before she was missed, but the genuine warmth in his invitation was too tempting to resist. "Thank you. I would like that." As they walked down the hill together, Ethan kept a respectful distance. "I called at your house yesterday," he said. "Your man wasn't particularly welcoming." "Peterson takes his duties seriously," Flora replied, carefully avoiding any direct criticism of her husband's orders. "May I ask why you called?" Ethan glanced at her. "To return this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small handkerchief. "You dropped it at the bookshop. It has your initials." Flora took the delicate square of fabric, their fingers brushing momentarily. "I didn't realize, thank you." "It was an excuse," Ethan admitted as they approached the camp. "I wanted to see you again." The honest confession took her breath away. No one spoke to her with such directness, such sincerity. Before she could formulate a response, they reached the campfire, where several men looked up with undisguised curiosity. "Boys, this is Mrs. Newson from town," Ethan announced. "Mrs. Newson, these are some of my men. That's Charlie at the coffee pot, best trail cook in the West. The young one is Tommy, and the ugly fellow with the beard is Mac." The men nodded respectfully, though Flora could see the questions in their eyes. A well-dressed woman appearing unaccompanied at a cattle camp was unusual, to say the least. Charlie offered her a cup of coffee, which she accepted gratefully. The strong brew was nothing like the delicate tea she drank at home, but she found its robust flavor suited the setting. "How many cattle are you moving, Mr. Sutton?" she asked, genuinely interested. 800 head. "We started with 1,000, but we've lost some along the way. Wolves, difficult river crossings, the usual hazards." "Where are you taking them?" "Montana Territory. I've purchased land near Helena. Good grass, good water. Planning to establish a permanent ranch there." Flora looked out at the vast herd. "It seems like such a dangerous journey. Why take the risk?" Ethan's eyes lit up with passion as he explained. "The railroad's coming. Soon it'll change everything about how cattle are moved. But for now, this is the way men, horses, and cattle moving across the country together. There's something pure about it, something honest." As he spoke, Flora found herself captivated not just by his words, but by the life they described, challenging and uncertain, yes, but also free from the stifling conventions that bound her own existence. "It sounds wonderful," she said softly. "To see so much of the country, to live under the open sky." Ethan studied her face. "It's not an easy life, especially for a woman, but there are women who choose it. Ranchers' wives who work alongside their husbands, building something together." There was an undertone to his words that made Flora's pulse quicken. Was he imagining her in such a role? The thought was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. "I should go," she said suddenly, setting down her coffee cup. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." "You haven't imposed at all." Ethan's voice was gentle. "But I understand. May I walk you back to the property line?" Flora nodded, relieved that he didn't press her to stay longer. As they walked away from the camp, side by side but still maintaining that proper distance, she struggled to understand the emotions swirling within her. In just 2 brief encounters, This man had awakened something she thought long dead, a desire for connection, for freedom, for a life filled with purpose. "How long will you be in Wallace?" she asked as they reached the edge of the Sullivan property. "Another 3 days. Then we move north." Ethan hesitated, then added, "I'd like to see you again before we go." Flora knew she should refuse. It was dangerous enough being here today, yet the thought of never seeing him again after he left was suddenly unbearable. "I don't know if that's possible," she said honestly. Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Your husband doesn't approve of you speaking to strangers." "My husband doesn't approve of many things." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Something shifted in Ethan's expression, concern, perhaps, or a deeper understanding of her situation. "Flora," he said softly, using her given name for the first time. "Are you happy?" No one had asked her that question in years. The simple inquiry broke something loose inside her, a dam of emotion she'd held back for too long. Tears filled her eyes before she could prevent them. "No," she whispered, the admission both shameful and liberating. "I haven't been happy for a very long time." Ethan's hand moved as if to reach for hers, then stopped. Even in this moment, he respected the boundaries between them. "I'm sorry," he said, and she could tell he meant it. No one should have to live without happiness. Flora wiped away her tears, embarrassed by her emotional display. "It doesn't matter, this is my life." "It does matter," Ethan insisted, his blue eyes intense. "And lives can change, Flora, I've seen it happen." She shook her head. "Not mine. There's nowhere for me to go, no way to leave." She straightened her shoulders, forcing composure. "I should never have come here. Please forget what I said." "I won't forget," he said quietly, "but I won't mention it again if that's what you want." Flora nodded gratefully. "Thank you for the coffee, Mr. Sutton, and for returning my handkerchief." "Ethan," he corrected. "My name is Ethan." "Ethan," she repeated, allowing herself just this one intimacy. "Goodbye." As she walked away, heading back toward the prison of her home, she felt his eyes following her. And despite the danger, despite the impossibility of it all, a small part of her hoped desperately that this wouldn't be their final meeting. Flora slipped back into the house undetected. Peterson was busy in the stables, and Martha was too engrossed in her baking to notice the slight flush in her mistress's cheeks or the grass stains on her boots. The rest of the day passed in a haze, with Flora going through the motions of her usual routine while her mind constantly returned to the conversation with Ethan. "Are you happy?" Such a simple question. Yet it had forced her to confront the truth she'd been denying for years. She wasn't just unhappy, she was withering away, day by day, in a marriage that was more cage than union. Harold didn't love her. He possessed her, like the fine furnishings in his house or the paintings on his walls. And now, having glimpsed another possibility, another kind of life through Ethan's eyes, the thought of continuing this existence was almost unbearable. That night, alone in her bed, Flora made a decision. She would see Ethan Sutton once more before he left Wallace. Just to talk, to experience again that feeling of being truly seen, truly heard. One final memory to sustain her through the years ahead. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The following afternoon, Mrs. Hollister arrived for her promised social call, bringing with her news that Flora's horse had been spotted grazing loose near town. "Peterson is beside himself," the older woman reported with evident satisfaction. "He's gone to fetch the animal before your husband returns. Such carelessness. Mr. Newson will be most displeased." Flora knew immediately what had happened. Ethan had somehow arranged this distraction, creating an opportunity for her to slip away. It was reckless and thoughtful all at once. "How dreadful," she murmured, hiding her sudden excitement. "Mrs. Hollister, would you excuse me for a moment? I should speak to Martha about this." Before the woman could object, Flora hurried from the room, but instead of going to the kitchen, she grabbed her shawl and slipped out the side door. Moving quickly through the garden and into the trees, she made her way toward the Sullivan property once more. This time, Ethan was waiting for her at the property line, seated on a fallen log with his hat beside him. He stood when he saw her approaching. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "You arranged for my horse to escape," she replied, unable to suppress a smile. Ethan shrugged, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "I might have suggested to young Tommy that a fine horse like that deserved some freedom. He's good with animals. He'll make sure your mount is found safe and sound." "It was clever," Flora admitted, "but also risky. If Peterson realizes what happened, he won't," Ethan assured her. "Tommy's too smart for that." They stood looking at each other for a moment, neither quite knowing how to proceed. Finally, Ethan gestured to the log. "Would you like to sit? I brought something to show you." Curious, Flora settled beside him, careful to maintain a proper distance. Ethan reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small leather-bound book. "You mentioned you enjoy reading," he said, handing it to her. "This is one of my favorites, poetry by Walt Whitman." Flora ran her fingers over the worn cover. "Leaves of Grass," she read. "I've heard of it, but Harold doesn't approve of Whitman. He says his work is too unconventional." "That's one way of putting it," Ethan agreed with a smile. "Whitman writes about freedom, about the connection between people and nature, about living authentically." Flora carefully opened the book, mindful of its well-loved pages. "Will you read something to me?" Ethan took the book back, flipping through the pages until he found what he was looking for. His deep voice gave new life to the words as he read. "The untold want, by life and land ne'er granted, now, voyager, sail thou forth to seek and find." The simple verse resonated through Flora like a bell, speaking directly to the yearning in her heart. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I thought of you when I read it this morning," Ethan said, closing the book. "There's something about you, Flora Newson, something that doesn't belong in that big house with all its rules and silence." His perception was unnerving. "You don't know me," she protested weakly. "I know enough," he replied. "I know your eyes come alive when you speak of books. I know you walk alone in the hills even though it's forbidden. I know you're trapped in a life that's suffocating you." Flora looked away, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze. "Even if that's true, what does it matter? As I told you yesterday, there's nowhere for me to go." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his words changed everything. "You could come with me." Flora's head snapped up, certain she'd misheard. "What? When we leave for Montana?" His voice was steady, his eyes never leaving hers. "You could come with us." The offer hung in the air between them, impossible and tempting all at once. "That's madness," she said finally. "I'm a married woman." "A woman trapped in a loveless marriage," Ethan countered. "A marriage you didn't choose. How did you people talk in small towns? I asked about you in the saloon. Heard how your father sold you to Newson to pay his debts." Anger flashed through Flora at the thought of her life being gossip fodder. "And what else did they say? That I'm fortunate? That many women would envy my position? That I have no right to complain? They said you deserve better," Ethan replied quietly. "The barkeeper's wife said she's never seen you smile, not once in 3 years. The shopkeeper said Newson treats his horses with more affection than his wife." Tears pricked at Flora's eyes. "Stop," she whispered. "Please." Ethan reached out, not touching her but letting his hand rest on the log between them, an offer, not a demand. "I'm not proposing anything improper, Flora. I'm offering you a chance at a different life. A life where you can choose your own path." "As what? Your mistress on the trail?" The words came out harsher than intended. "No," Ethan said firmly. As a free woman, you'd have your own wagon, your own space, no obligations to me or anyone else. When we reach Montana, you could decide what you want, stay and work at the ranch, go on to another town, whatever you choose. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. This wasn't a seduction, it was a rescue, or at least that's what he believed it to be. Why would you do this for me? Flora asked, genuinely bewildered. You barely know me. Ethan's expression softened. Because the first time I saw you in town, I recognized something in you, a spark that's being smothered, and because I know what it's like to be trapped in a life you didn't choose. He paused, then added more quietly, and because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since that moment. The confession sent a warm flutter through Flora's chest. No one had ever spoken to her with such honesty, such genuine concern for her happiness. It's impossible, she said, though with less conviction than before. Harold would never grant me a divorce. He'd hunt me down, bring me back by force. Not where we're going, Ethan assured her. Montana's still wild country. A woman can disappear there, start fresh. Flora shook her head, overwhelmed. I need time to think about this. It's too much, of course. Ethan nodded, understanding. We leave at dawn the day after tomorrow. If you decide to come, meet me here an hour before sunrise. He hesitated, then added, I won't blame you if you don't come, Flora. I understand what I'm asking. He stood, offering her his hand to help her up. After a moment's hesitation, Flora took it. The warm strength of his fingers around hers sent a shock of awareness through her body. Keep the book, he said, pressing the volume of poetry into her free hand. Whatever you decide. Flora nodded, unable to form words around the emotions clogging her throat. As she turned to leave, Ethan's voice stopped her one last time. Flora, he called softly, you deserve happiness. Remember that. She hurried away without looking back, the book clutched tightly against her chest, his words echoing in her mind. You deserve happiness. Such a simple statement, yet so revolutionary to a woman who had been taught that her only value lay in duty and obedience. That night, Flora couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, the moonlight streaming through the window, illuminating the volume of Whitman's poetry on her nightstand. Over and over, she turned Ethan's offer in her mind, examining it from every angle. To leave with him would mean abandoning everything she knew. She would be labeled a fallen woman, an adulteress, even though Ethan had made it clear there would be no expectations between them. Her reputation would be in tatters. She would have nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever she could carry, yet staying meant a slow death of the spirit. Years stretching ahead in this beautiful prison, with a husband who saw her as property, not a partner. No children. Harold had made it clear he had no interest in fatherhood. No love, no joy, just endless days of empty propriety. Dawn found her still awake, no closer to a decision. She dressed mechanically and went downstairs to face another day of pretending everything was fine. A telegram arrived mid-morning. Harold would be delayed another 2 days in Coeur d'Alene. The miners' strike was proving more difficult to resolve than anticipated. Flora read the message twice, seeing in it not just a reprieve from her husband's cold presence, but also an opportunity. If she left with Ethan, Harold wouldn't even know she was gone until they were well on their way to Montana. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Throughout the day, she found herself mentally cataloging what she would take if she went. The pearl earrings from her mother, the small amount of money she had saved from her household allowance, a few practical dresses, nothing too fine, her warmest shawl for the mountain nights. By evening, she realized she had made her decision, even if she hadn't fully admitted it to herself yet. When Martha bid her good night, Flora sat alone in her bedroom, Whitman's words open before her. Now, voyager, sail thou forth to seek and find. Could she do it? Could she actually leave everything behind and journey into the unknown with a man she barely knew, on nothing more than the promise of freedom and the potential for happiness? The night passed slowly, with Flora drifting in and out of restless sleep. In her dreams, she saw herself on horseback, riding beside Ethan across vast meadows, the wind in her hair, laughter on her lips. She saw herself by a campfire, surrounded by people who spoke to her as an equal, not a possession. She saw a small cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, flowers in the garden, and Ethan waiting for her on the porch, his blue eyes filled with something that looked remarkably like love. She woke in the gray pre-dawn light, her decision made. Moving quietly, Flora dressed in her simplest traveling outfit and sturdy boots. She packed a small carpetbag with only the essentials: a change of clothes, her mother's earrings, the saved money, and Ethan's book of poetry. Around her neck, she fastened the locket that held miniature portraits of her parents. Then she sat down at her writing desk and penned a brief note to Harold. "I cannot continue in this life of silent desperation. Do not search for me. I release you from our marriage as I now release myself. Flora." She placed the note on her pillow, took one last look around the bedroom that had been her prison for 3 years, and slipped downstairs. The house was silent, Martha still asleep in her quarters, Peterson likely making his early rounds of the far side of the property. Flora's heart pounded as she eased open the side door and stepped out into the cool morning air. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, stars still visible overhead. She moved quickly through the garden and into the trees, following now familiar path toward the Sullivan property. What if he wasn't there? What if yesterday had been nothing more than a momentary fancy on his part, an impulsive offer already regretted and forgotten? But as she approached their meeting spot, she saw him, a tall silhouette against the lightening sky, standing beside his horse. Relief washed over her so intensely that her knees nearly buckled. Ethan saw her at the same moment, his face breaking into a smile that chased away the last of her doubts. He started toward her, closing the distance between them with long strides. "You came," he said, wonder in his voice. Flora nodded, suddenly unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. This was real. She was really doing this, leaving behind everything she knew for a chance at freedom. "Are you certain?" Ethan asked, searching her face. "There's still time to go back." "I'm certain," Flora said, finding her voice at last. "I can't stay there anymore. I want—" She took a deep breath. "I want to seek and find." Understanding and admiration filled Ethan's eyes as he recognized Whitman's words. "Then let's go," he said simply, offering his hand. This time, Flora took it without hesitation. As their fingers intertwined, she felt something shift inside her, fear giving way to hope, resignation to possibility. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges they might face, she was choosing this path. For the first time in her adult life, she was making a choice that was truly her own. The cattle drive was already breaking camp when they arrived. Men moved efficiently, loading wagons and saddling horses, preparing for the day's journey. A few glanced curiously at Flora but asked no questions. It seemed Ethan had already prepared them for the possibility of her arrival. "This is Charlie's wagon," Ethan explained, leading her to a covered wagon near the edge of camp. "He's offered to share it with you. He'll sleep under the stars with the rest of us." The cook nodded at her from where he was packing his supplies. "Madam, made room for your things." "Thank you," Flora said, touched by the kindness of these strangers. "I don't want to be a burden." "No burden," Charlie assured her. "Boss says you're coming with us. That's good enough for me." Ethan squeezed her hand before releasing it. "I need to help with the herd. We'll be moving out soon. Charlie will show you what you need to know." As he walked away to join the other cowboys, Flora felt a momentary panic. What had she done? She knew nothing about cattle drives or life on the trail. She had no skills that would be useful to these men. She was an impulsive fool who had thrown away security for an impossible dream. Charlie must have seen the fear on her face. "First time's always scary," he said conversationally as he continued packing. "First cattle drive I went on, I was 16 and greener than spring grass. Thought for sure I'd die out there." "Did you?" Flora asked, grateful for the distraction. The cook laughed. "Not yet. You learn quick on the trail, Mrs. Newson, and folks help each other. That's the first rule. Please call me Flora," she said, realizing that she had left Mrs. Newson behind with the house on the hill. "And I'm willing to learn to do my share." Charlie nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit. Now, let me show you how this wagon works. You'll be riding up here with me most days, but it helps to know how everything's packed." As the older man explained the organization of the wagon, pointing out where food, water, and medical supplies were stored, Flora found her anxiety slowly ebbing. There was something refreshingly straightforward about Charlie's manner, no hidden judgments or social niceties, just practical information freely shared. Within the hour, the entire camp was packed and ready to move. The cowboys expertly gathered the cattle, forming them into a manageable herd. Ethan rode back to the wagon, his horse prancing beneath him. "Ready?" he asked Flora, his eyes searching hers for any sign of regret. She looked back toward Wallace one last time. Somewhere in that town was the house she had fled, the life she was leaving behind. By now, Martha would have found her note. Soon, Harold would know she was gone. But ahead lay the open trail, the unknown future, and a man who had offered her freedom without conditions. The choice was clear. "Ready," Flora confirmed, settling onto the wagon seat beside Charlie. Ethan's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. With a nod to Charlie, he turned his horse and rode to the head of the herd. A moment later, his voice rang out across the meadow. "Move him out." The cattle drive lurched into motion, wagons creaking, cowboys whooping, the vast herd flowing like a living river across the land. Flora felt a strange lightness in her chest, a sensation she eventually recognized as joy. For the first time in years, she was moving forward, not just existing. For the first time, she was free. The first days on the trail were a shock to Flora's system. Accustomed to the comforts of Harold's house, she found herself facing physical demands unlike anything she'd experienced before. The days were long, starting before dawn and continuing until dusk. The wagon seat was hard, the terrain rough. Dust coated everything, working its way into her clothes, her hair, even the food. Yet, despite the discomforts, Flora found herself adapting with surprising ease. There was something liberating about the simplicity of trail life, no social calls to navigate, no pretenses to maintain. Each task had a clear purpose, each challenge a straightforward solution. Charlie proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to help with meals, how to care for the wagon, how to make coffee strong enough to satisfy the cowboys after a long day's ride. In turn, Flora used her organizational skills to improve the wagon's storage system and taught Charlie a few cooking techniques she had learned from Martha. And then there was Ethan. Though his responsibilities as trail boss kept him busy from dawn until dusk, he made time each day to check on her, to sit beside her at the evening fire, to share stories of his previous cattle drives and his plans for the Montana ranch. They developed an easy friendship, built on mutual respect and shared conversations. Ethan never pushed for more, never made her feel she owed him anything for the freedom he had helped her claim. Yet Flora found herself increasingly aware of him in ways that went beyond friendship, the strength in his hands as he helped her down from the wagon, the way firelight played across his features at night, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. A week into the journey, as they made camp beside a small river, Ethan found Flora sitting alone by the water's edge, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling beside her on the grassy bank. Flora smiled. "I was thinking about how different everything is. A week ago, I was arranging flowers in Harold's parlor and dreading another silent dinner. Now I'm here, covered in trail dust, eating Charlie's beans and feeling more alive than I have in years. No regrets, then." She turned to look at him directly. "None, though I do wonder what Harold did when he found my note, whether he's looking for me." Ethan's expression grew serious. "I sent a man back to Wallace this morning with a message for the sheriff. Anonymous, but clear that you left of your own free will, that you're safe, and that Newson should let you go." "Will he?" Flora asked, doubt creeping into her voice. "Eventually," Ethan said with quiet confidence. "Men like Newson care most about their pride. Once the gossip dies down, he'll likely prefer to forget you than admit his wife ran away." The blunt assessment stung slightly, but Flora knew it was probably accurate. Harold's concern had always been for appearances, never for her happiness or well-being. "Thank you," she said. "For thinking of that, for thinking of everything," Ethan shrugged. "I want you to be free, truly free, not looking over your shoulder." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the river flow past. "May I ask you something?" Flora ventured. "Anything? Why are you doing this? Taking such risks for someone you barely knew?" It was a question that had lingered in her mind since that day at the Sullivan property. Ethan was quiet for so long that Flora wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was reflective, almost distant. "When I was 19, I was in love with a girl named Sarah. Her father was the richest man in our town, and I was just a ranch hand. We planned to run away together to start a life somewhere her father couldn't find us." He paused, his eyes on the river. "The night we were supposed to leave, she didn't come. I waited until dawn, but she never appeared." Flora's heart ached for the young man he had been. "What happened?" "Her father found our letters, locked her in her room. 2 months later, she was married to a banker twice her age." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I saw her once years after. She looked empty, like everything that made her Sarah was gone." Understanding dawned on Flora. "You saw something of her in me." Ethan nodded. "When I saw you in town that first day, something in your eyes reminded me of her. And when I learned about your situation with Newson." He turned to face her, his expression intense. "I couldn't stand by and watch another woman's spirit be crushed by a man who sees her as property." "So this is about Sarah," Flora said softly, trying to ignore the disappointment settling in her chest. "It was," Ethan admitted. "At first." His hand moved to cover hers on the grass between them. "But not anymore, Flora. Now it's about you, just you." The simple touch of his hand on hers sent warmth spiraling through Flora's body. She looked down at their intertwined fingers, then back up to his face. In his eyes, she saw not just compassion but something deeper, something that made her breath catch. "Ethan," she whispered, hardly knowing what she wanted to say. A shout from the camp broke the moment. "Boss, riders coming." Ethan was on his feet instantly, helping Flora up. "Stay by the wagon," he instructed, his voice shifting to the authoritative tone he used with his men. "It's probably nothing, but just in case." Flora hurried back to camp, anxiety knotting in her stomach. What if Harold had somehow tracked them down? What if he had sent men after her? The entire camp was on alert, cowboys reaching for rifles, moving protectively toward the cattle. Ethan strode to meet young Tommy, who had been on watch. "How many?" he asked sharply. "3 riders," Tommy reported. "Coming fast from the south." Ethan grabbed his rifle from his saddle. Get Mrs. Newson in the wagon, Charlie. Everyone else stay calm but ready. Flora allowed Charlie to usher her into the covered wagon, but she refused to cower in fear. Instead, she peered out through a gap in the canvas, watching as Ethan and 3 of his men positioned themselves to meet the approaching riders. The tension in the camp was palpable as the riders came into view. To Flora's immense relief, they weren't Harold's men, just 3 cowboys, strangers by the look of them. Ethan stepped forward, rifle lowered but ready. "Evening, gentlemen. You're riding awful hard for this time of day." The lead rider, a weathered man with a graying beard, reined his horse to a stop. "You the Sutton outfit?" "I'm Ethan Sutton," Ethan confirmed, his stance still wary. "What's your business?" "Name's Miller. We're riding for the Box T ranch up near the Montana border." "Thought you should know there's trouble ahead." The man wiped sweat from his brow. "Rustlers hit 2 herds in the past week. 30 men at least, well armed, taking cattle and killing anyone who resists." A murmur ran through the camp at this news. Cattle rustling was always a threat on the trail, but a gang that size was unusual and dangerous. "Where exactly?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. "Narrow valley about 40 miles north of here. Only good route through those mountains for a herd this size." Miller pointed toward the distant peaks. "They're waiting for drives like yours. We lost 15 head and 2 good men before we turned back." Flora watched as Ethan absorbed this information, his face grave. "I appreciate the warning," he said finally. "You and your men are welcome to share our fire tonight." Miller nodded gratefully. "Much obliged. Been riding hard since morning." As the tension eased, Flora emerged from the wagon. Ethan saw her and came over, his expression troubled. "You heard?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "What will you do?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. "We can't turn back, and going around those mountains would add weeks to our journey, weeks we don't have before winter sets in." He looked toward the cattle, his livelihood and future. "But I won't risk my men against odds like that." "There must be another way," Flora said, hating to see his confidence shaken. Ethan gave her a tired smile. "I'll figure something out, I always do." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "Don't worry about it tonight, get some rest." But that night sleep eluded Flora. From her place in the wagon, she could hear the men talking around the fire, discussing options, none of them good. This cattle drive was everything to Ethan, his savings, his future, his dream of establishing a ranch in Montana. To lose it to rustlers would be devastating, and it would be her fault. If he hadn't been concerned with getting her safely away from Wallace, they might have been through that valley before the rustlers set up their ambush. Her presence had slowed them down, made them more vulnerable. By morning, Flora had made a decision of her own. As the camp began to stir, she sought out Ethan, finding him studying a crude map with Miller and his foreman, Mac. "There has to be another pass," Ethan was saying as she approached. "Something less obvious." Miller shook his head. "Not for a herd this size. Any other route would mean breaking them into smaller groups, and that leaves you even more vulnerable." Flora cleared her throat, drawing their attention. "May I speak with you, Mr. Sutton, privately?" The men exchanged glances, but Ethan nodded. "Of course." He led her a short distance from the others. "What is it?" Flora took a deep breath. "I think I should go back to Wallace." Ethan stared at her, clearly stunned. "What? Why would you even think that?" "Because I'm putting everyone at risk," she explained, the words tumbling out in a rush. "If I wasn't with you, you could move faster, take more risks if needed. You might have been past that valley before the rustlers arrived." "Flora, that's nonsense," Ethan said firmly. "The rustlers would have been a threat with or without you, and I'm not sending you back to Newson. But your cattle, your dream, are not worth sacrificing you." His voice was low but intense. I meant what I said about wanting you to be free. That hasn't changed." The conviction in his words warmed her, but Flora stood her ground. "I'm not suggesting going back to Harold. But perhaps I could wait in the next town while you get the herd through the dangerous area. Then you could send someone back for me." Ethan studied her face, seeing the determination there. "You really want to do this?" "I want to help," Flora said simply. "Not be a burden." Something shifted in his expression, then respect, admiration, and something deeper that made her heart beat faster. "You are many things, Flora Newson," he said softly, "but never a burden." Before she could respond, he continued, "But you've given me an idea. Not about sending you away, that's not happening, but about using the town to our advantage." "How?" Ethan's eyes lit up with the beginnings of a plan. "The rustlers are watching the main trail, expecting cattle drives to come through. But what if we're not a cattle drive? What if we're just a rancher and his wife, moving a small herd to a new homestead?" Flora caught on immediately. "A disguise." "Exactly. We send most of the men and cattle ahead by a different route, harder, slower, but safer. Meanwhile, you and I and a couple of the men drive a small group of cattle right past the rustlers, bold as brass. Just a family relocating, not worth their trouble." "But won't they still try to take even a small herd?" Flora asked. Ethan shook his head. "Rustlers like that want big scores, not the trouble of attacking what looks like settlers for a few dozen head. It's not worth the attention it would bring." The plan was audacious, risky, and brilliant. "And once we're past them, we rejoin the main herd," Flora concluded. "Yes. We'd meet up north of the valley, then continue to Montana together." There was one obvious implication that neither of them had voiced. For this plan to work, they would need to convincingly play the role of husband and wife. The thought sent a flutter of nervous anticipation through Flora's stomach. "You think it will work?" she asked. Ethan's confidence had returned, his eyes bright with determination. "With you by my side?" "Yes, I do." Something in the way he said those words, "with you by my side," made Flora's breath catch. This wasn't just about saving the cattle drive anymore. It was about them together, facing danger as equals, as partners. "Then let's do it," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. Ethan's smile was worth every risk, every uncertainty that lay ahead. "I'll tell the men. We'll need to reach town by nightfall to make our preparations." The small mining town of Clearwater wasn't much to look at, one dusty main street lined with the usual establishments: saloon, general store, hotel, and assorted businesses. But to Flora and Ethan's purpose, it was perfect. A place where strangers passed through regularly, where questions weren't asked as long as money changed hands. While the bulk of the cattle drive continued on a more circuitous route under Mac's leadership, Flora, Ethan, and two trusted cowboys, Charlie and young Tommy, prepared for their dangerous masquerade. They selected 50 of the best cattle, purchased a second wagon to appear more like settlers, and most importantly, obtained the items that would transform Flora from a runaway wife to a convincing frontier woman. In the privacy of a rented hotel room, Flora exchanged her traveling dress for simple calico, adorned only with a plain wedding band Ethan had purchased from the general store. She plaited her hair into a practical braid and added a sunbonnet to protect her fair skin. When she looked in the mirror, a different woman stared back at her, not the ornamental Mrs. Newson of Wallace, but a capable pioneer woman, the kind who built lives alongside their husbands in this harsh but beautiful country. A soft knock at the door interrupted her contemplation. "Flora." "Are you ready?" Ethan's voice called. She opened the door to find him similarly transformed. Gone was the trail boss in his practical leather vest and chaps. In their place stood a respectable homesteader in a clean but well-worn shirt, suspenders, and sturdy work pants. He had trimmed his beard and combed his hair, looking every inch the hard-working husband. His eyes widened slightly as he took in her appearance. "You look." He seemed to search for the right word. "Perfect." Flora felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "So do you, very convincing." They stood looking at each other for a moment, both acutely aware of the intimate charade they were about to undertake. "I got you something else," Ethan said finally, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For the journey." Curious, Flora unwrapped it to find a delicate silver pendant on a chain, a tiny bird in flight. "It's beautiful," she breathed, touching it gently. "I saw it in the store and thought of you," Ethan explained, his voice soft. "A bird finding its freedom." The thoughtfulness of the gift moved Flora deeply. Without thinking, she stood on tiptoe and pressed a kiss to his cheek. "Thank you." Ethan's hand came up to touch the spot where her lips had been, surprise and pleasure in his eyes. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the necklace. Flora nodded, turning so he could fasten it around her neck. His fingers were warm against her skin as he secured the clasp, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. When she faced him again, something had changed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing since that first meeting in Wallace. "We should join the others," Ethan said, his voice slightly rougher than before. "We need to be on the road by noon." Flora nodded, suddenly unable to trust her voice. As they walked downstairs to where Charlie and Tommy waited with the wagons and cattle, she was acutely aware of Ethan beside her, not just as her rescuer or friend, but as a man who stirred feelings in her that she had never experienced before. Not even in the early days with Harold, when she had tried desperately to make the best of her arranged marriage. This was different. This was real. They left Clearwater shortly after noon, their small caravan looking exactly like what they pretended to be, a family relocating to new lands. Charlie drove the supply wagon, while Tommy handled the cattle with Ethan's help. Flora rode beside Charlie, playing the role of frontier wife with surprising ease. As they traveled north toward the valley where the rustlers were reportedly waiting, Flora found herself watching Ethan whenever he rode close to the wagon. There was something deeply attractive about seeing him in this new light, not just the confident trail boss, but a man who could adapt to any situation, who planned meticulously to protect those in his care. That night, they made camp beside a small stream, maintaining their settler disguise in case anyone was watching. Charlie prepared dinner while Tommy tended the cattle. Ethan and Flora set up what appeared to be a family campsite, complete with a small tent that they would supposedly share as husband and wife. "You'll take the tent," Ethan told her quietly as they worked. "I'll sleep by the fire with the others." The consideration touched Flora, even as a small part of her felt a twinge of disappointment. "Thank you, but won't that look suspicious if we're being watched? A husband sleeping apart from his wife." Ethan paused in hammering a tent stake. "I hadn't thought of that," he admitted, a slight flush coloring his tanned face. "Perhaps we could make it appear as though you're sleeping in the tent, but actually stay by the fire," Flora suggested, surprising herself with her practical approach to what should have been an awkward conversation. "Good idea," Ethan agreed, relief evident in his voice. "I'll put my bedroll in there, make it look occupied after you've settled in." As darkness fell and they gathered around the campfire, Flora found herself reflecting on how quickly life could change. A month ago, the idea of sitting beneath the stars, planning how to outwit cattle rustlers while pretending to be married to a man like Ethan Sutton would have seemed like something from a dime novel. Now it was her reality, dangerous, uncertain, but undeniably thrilling. "Penny for your thoughts," Ethan said softly, echoing his words from days earlier as he sat beside her on a fallen log. Flora smiled. "I was just thinking about how strange life can be, all the twists and turns that led me here. Do you ever regret it? Leaving?" His voice was casual, but she could hear the genuine concern beneath the question. "Not for a moment," she answered truthfully. "Even with rustlers and danger ahead, I feel more alive now than I ever did in that house in Wallace." Ethan's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I'm glad," he said simply. They sat like that for a long moment, watching the flames dance, their joined hands hidden from Charlie and Tommy by the folds of Flora's skirt. It was a small intimacy, but it sent warmth spreading through her body that had nothing to do with the fire. Later, as Flora settled into the tent alone, she could hear Ethan and the others talking quietly by the fire, discussing plans for the dangerous day ahead. Tomorrow they would enter the valley where the rustlers had been attacking cattle drives. Their disguise would be put to the test. Despite the danger, Flora found herself more excited than afraid. For the first time in her life, she was having an adventure, making her own choices, taking risks for something she believed in. And she was doing it alongside a man who saw her not as a possession or an ornament, but as a partner. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would face it with courage. And with Ethan by her side, the valley stretched before them, a narrow passage between towering mountains. Under different circumstances, Flora might have found it beautiful, the pine-covered slopes, the clear stream running alongside the trail, the wildflowers dotting the meadows. But today her eyes scanned the ridgelines and rock formations, searching for any sign of the rustlers they knew were watching. "Remember," Ethan had instructed that morning, "we're just a family moving to new land. You're my wife, Flora Sutton. We've been married 3 years and are looking for a fresh start in Montana." The false identity felt strangely right on her lips as they rehearsed their story. Flora Sutton, a name that represented freedom rather than possession. Now, as they made their way deeper into the valley, the tension was palpable. Charlie drove the lead wagon with Flora beside him, both of them maintaining casual conversation as if they had no concerns beyond reaching their destination. Behind them, Ethan and Tommy guided the small herd of cattle, alert for any movement from the surrounding hills. "See anything?" Flora asked quietly during a lull in their manufactured conversation. Charlie's eyes never stopped scanning the terrain. "Nothing yet, but they're watching." "I can feel it." He was right. The sensation of being observed prickled along Flora's skin. She resisted the urge to look directly at the hillsides, instead keeping her movements natural, adjusting her sunbonnet, occasionally pointing out a particularly vibrant patch of wildflowers to Charlie, as if she had not a care in the world. They were halfway through the valley when Ethan rode up alongside the wagon, his expression carefully neutral despite the tension evident in his shoulders. "Everything all right, dear?" Flora asked, slipping easily into her role as his wife. "Just fine," Ethan replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thought I'd ride ahead a bit, check the trail." The subtle warning in his voice told Flora everything she needed to know. He had spotted something or someone up ahead. "Don't be long," she said, reaching out to touch his arm in a gesture that would look affectionate to anyone watching but also allowed her to feel the tension in his muscles. "You know how I worry." Ethan's eyes softened momentarily, his hand covering hers. "I'll be careful." The words carried a double meaning that wasn't lost on Flora. As he rode ahead, she noticed how his hand casually rested near the rifle in his saddle holster. Charlie's pace with the wagon remained steady, but she could see how his posture had changed, more alert, more ready for trouble. They continued for another mile, the silence growing heavier with each passing minute. Where was Ethan? He should have returned by now. Flora found herself genuinely worried, her act of the concerned wife no longer entirely pretense. Then, around a bend in the trail, they saw him. Ethan sat on his horse, talking with three rough-looking men who had apparently stopped him on the path. From this distance, the conversation appeared civil, but Flora could see the wariness in Ethan's posture, the way he kept his horse positioned for quick movement if needed. "There they are," Charlie murmured. "Some of them, at least." "What do we do?" Flora whispered, fear coiling in her stomach. "Keep playing our parts," Charlie advised. "Let the boss handle it. He's good at talking his way out of trouble." As they drew closer, Flora could make out more details of the three men. They were dusty and unshaven, with hard eyes that evaluated everything for its worth or threat. Two wore pistols openly on their hips, while the third had a rifle resting across his saddle. All three turned to watch as the wagon approached. "Ah, here's my wife now," Ethan called, his voice relaxed despite the dangerous situation. "Flora, these gentlemen were just asking where we're headed." Flora summoned her most pleasant smile, channeling years of social training into this most important performance. "Good day, gentlemen," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The apparent leader of the three men touched his hat brim in a mockery of politeness. "Madam, your husband says you're headed to Montana. Long way for a family." "We have family there," Flora replied, the lie coming easily. "My cousin has land near Helena. He's been asking us to join him for years." The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's so, and these cattle are all you're bringing?" "Started with more," Ethan said with a rueful smile. "Lost some to river crossings, some to sickness. Enough left to start our herd once we reach my cousin's place." The three men exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Flora held her breath, aware that their lives might depend on whether these rustlers believed their story or saw through the disguise to the valuable cattle drive that had been split up. "You've picked a dangerous route," the leader said finally. "There have been reports of rustlers in these parts. A small party like yours might be an easy target." "Appreciate the warning," Ethan said easily. "But we're well armed and these cattle are our future. We defend them." The implicit threat wasn't lost on the rustlers. They were evaluating the risk versus reward, a small herd but a potentially deadly resistance. The leader's gaze shifted to Flora, something calculating in his eyes. "Pretty wife you've got. Sure she's up for frontier life?" Flora felt a chill at the man's tone but maintained her composure. "I was raised on a farm in Oregon, sir. I'm no stranger to hard work." "That right?" The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, the trail ahead is rough. Might be safer if you had some escort." The offer was a thinly veiled threat. Ethan's hand moved imperceptibly closer to his weapon. "That's mighty kind, but we can manage. My friend back there," he nodded toward Charlie, "is a veteran of the war, crack shot. Between the three of us, we keep what's ours safe." The tension stretched between them, a silent battle of wills. Flora could see Tommy with the cattle behind them, his young face set in determination, one hand on his pistol. Charlie sat beside her, outwardly calm but ready to reach for the shotgun stowed beneath the wagon seat. Finally, the leader shrugged. "Suit yourself. Just thought we'd offer some neighborly help." He gathered his reins. "Come on, boys. These folks want to take their chances alone." As the three men turned their horses and rode up a side trail into the hills, Flora released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Ethan waited until they were out of sight, then rode quickly back to the wagon. "They're going to report to the others," he said in a low voice. "We need to move fast. The end of the valley is about 3 miles ahead. If we can get there before they decide we're worth attacking after all, we'll be in open country where they're less likely to risk it." Charlie nodded, snapping the reins to urge the horses to a faster pace. "We'll make it." The next hour was the longest of Flora's life. They moved as quickly as they dared without appearing to flee, constantly scanning the surrounding hills for signs of pursuit. Occasionally, Flora would spot movement a rider on a distant ridge, watching their progress. Each time, her heart would race, expecting an attack that never came. Finally, the valley began to widen, the steep walls giving way to more gentle slopes. Ahead, Flora could see open grassland stretching toward distant mountain safety, or at least a place where the rustlers would have less advantage. "We're going to make it," she said, hardly daring to believe it. Ethan rode close to the wagon, his expression grim but determined. "Don't celebrate yet. The next mile is still dangerous." As if his words had tempted fate, a shot rang out from the hillside, kicking up dirt near the wagon. Charlie swore and snapped the reins hard, sending the horses into a gallop. "Get down!" Ethan shouted, drawing his rifle. Flora ducked below the wagon's seat as more shots followed the first. Through the chaos, she could hear Tommy yelling as he drove the cattle into a run, keeping them bunched and moving toward the valley's exit. Ethan returned fire, aiming not directly at their attackers but at the rocks above them, forcing them to take cover. Charlie kept the wagon moving at breakneck speed, the vehicle bouncing so violently over the rough trail that Flora had to cling to the seat to avoid being thrown out. "Almost there," Charlie shouted over the gunfire. "Hold on." Flora risked raising her head enough to see that they were indeed nearing the end of the valley. The rustlers seemed to realize their opportunity was slipping away. More riders had appeared on both sides of the trail, firing with increasing desperation. A bullet splintered the wagon's side panel inches from Flora's head. Another struck one of their water barrels, sending a spray of liquid across the wagon bed. But Charlie kept the team running, and Ethan's covering fire prevented the rustlers from getting close enough for more accurate shots. With a final surge, they broke free of the valley's confines, emerging onto the open plain beyond. The rustlers pulled up at the valley's mouth, apparently unwilling to pursue them into terrain that offered less cover and more risk of being seen by other travelers. "Keep going," Ethan ordered, riding alongside the wagon. "Don't stop until we reach those trees." He pointed toward a distant copse about a mile ahead. Flora clung to the seat as Charlie maintained their pace, the cattle running behind them, driven forward by Tommy's skilled herding. Only when they reached the shelter of the trees did they finally halt. The horses were lathered with sweat, the cattle milling nervously, everyone breathing hard from the tension and exertion. Ethan dismounted quickly, moving to help Flora down from the wagon. His hands gripped her waist firmly, but instead of setting her on the ground immediately, he pulled her close, his arms encircling her in a fierce embrace. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "When that bullet hit the wagon, I thought, I'm fine," Flora assured him, her own arms wrapping around his solid form, drawing strength from his warmth. "We all are." For a long moment they stood like that, holding each other as the adrenaline of their escape slowly subsided. Flora could feel Ethan's heart racing against her cheek, matching the rapid beat of her own. When they finally separated, his hands lingered on her shoulders, his eyes scanning her face as if to reassure himself she was truly unharmed. "You were amazing back there," he said softly. "So calm, so quick thinking." "I was terrified," Flora admitted with a shaky laugh. "That's what makes it brave," Ethan replied, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Doing what needs to be done despite the fear." Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing since that first meeting in Wallace. Flora saw it in his eyes, felt it in the way his hands tightened slightly on her shoulders. Then Charlie cleared his throat behind them, and the moment passed. Ethan stepped back, turning to check on the damage to the wagon and cattle. But the connection remained, a current running between them that Flora knew could no longer be ignored. They had survived. And in the process, she had discovered a strength within herself she never knew existed, a strength that matched the growing feeling in her heart. A feeling for Ethan Sutton that was becoming impossible to deny. They spent that night in a defensive camp, taking turns on watch in case the rustlers decided to pursue them after all, but no attack came. By morning, Ethan was confident they had left the danger behind. "We need to find Mac and the main herd," he said as they broke camp. "According to our plan, they should be about 15 miles northwest of here by now." It took nearly 2 days of traveling across open grassland to locate the rest of their party. When they finally spotted the dust of the larger herd in the distance, a cheer went up from their small group. Mac and the others rode out to meet them, their faces lighting up with relief at seeing their boss and companion safe. "We were starting to worry," Mac admitted as they joined forces once again. "When we heard gunshots echoing from the valley yesterday, some of the boys wanted to go back for you." "Good thing you didn't," Ethan replied, explaining their narrow escape. "But we made it through with all 50 head intact." That night, reunited with the full cattle drive, the atmosphere around the campfire was celebratory. The cowboys shared stories and songs, relief at having navigated the danger making them more boisterous than usual. Flora sat slightly apart, watching Ethan as he talked with his men, accepted their congratulations, shared credit for their success. In the firelight, his face was animated, his blue eyes reflecting the dancing flames. She found she couldn't look away from him, this man who had offered her freedom without conditions, who had risked his life and livelihood to protect her, who had shown her what it meant to be truly respected as an equal. As if feeling her gaze, Ethan glanced in her direction. Their eyes met across the fire, and the conversation around him seemed to fade as his attention focused solely on her. After a moment, he excused himself from his men and made his way to where she sat. "May I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the space beside her on the fallen log. Flora nodded, suddenly shy despite all they had been through together. Ethan settled next to her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body in the cooling night air. "The men are saying you should be the one leading this outfit," he said with a smile. "The way you handled those rustlers, never faltering, never breaking character," Flora laughed softly. "I was only following your lead." She hesitated, then added more seriously, "Thank you, Ethan, for everything. For offering me a way out of Wallace, for protecting me during the escape, for making me feel valuable." Ethan turned toward her, his expression earnest in the firelight. "You are valuable, Flora, not as a possession or an ornament, but as a person. As a woman of courage and intelligence and heart." The sincerity in his voice made tears prick at her eyes. "No one has ever seen me that way before," she whispered. "Then they were blind," Ethan said simply. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "These past weeks, traveling with you, getting to know you, they've been the best of my life." Flora's breath caught at the tender gesture and the emotion behind his words. "For me too," she admitted. Something changed in Ethan's eyes, then a decision made, a boundary crossed. "Flora," he said, his voice low and serious, "I need to tell you something. Something I've been feeling but haven't said because of the circumstances, because of your situation, because I didn't want you to think I expected anything from you in return for helping you leave Wallace." "What is it?" she asked, though her heart already knew the answer, had known it perhaps since that day by the river when he had told her about Sarah. "I'm falling in love with you," Ethan said, the simple declaration hanging in the air between them. "Not because you remind me of someone from my past, not because of some heroic notion of rescue, but because of who you are, your strength, your kindness, your spirit. I love the way you face challenges, the way you've embraced this new life without complaints, the way you see beauty in small things." He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I don't expect you to feel the same. You've been through so much, and you deserve time to discover who you are without a man's expectations shaping your choices. So I'm not asking for anything. I just couldn't go another day without telling you the truth." Tears spilled onto Flora's cheeks, not of sadness but of a joy so profound it overwhelmed her. "Ethan," she whispered, her free hand rising to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his beard beneath her fingers. "I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself. After Harold, after being treated like property for so long, I didn't trust what I was feeling. But the truth is, I'm falling in love with you too." The wonder that spread across Ethan's face at her words was a sight Flora knew she would remember all her days. "Flora," he breathed, leaning closer until their foreheads touched. "May I kiss you?" The question, so respectful, so different from Harold's demanding hands and cold lips, made her heart swell with even greater feeling. "Yes," she whispered. Ethan's mouth met hers gently at first, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened as Flora responded with all the emotion she had been holding back. His arms encircled her, drawing her closer, and she melted against him, feeling truly cherished for the first time in her life. When they finally parted, both breathless, Ethan kept her close, his eyes searching hers in the firelight. "I want to court you properly," he said, his voice husky. "When we reach Montana, when you've had time to settle, to be sure of what you want, I won't rush you, Flora. We have time." Flora smiled, her heart fuller than she had ever thought possible. "I'd like that," she agreed. "A proper courtship." Then, with a touch of the boldness that had been growing in her since leaving Wallace, she added, "But I hope it includes more kisses like that one." Ethan's laugh was warm and rich in the night air. "As many as you wish," he promised, pressing his lips to her forehead in a gesture of tenderness that moved her deeply. They sat together by the fire late into the night, talking of the future, of the ranch Ethan planned to build in Montana, of Flora's dreams for a life of purpose and meaning. And when they finally parted to seek their separate sleeping places, it was with the knowledge that something precious had begun between them, something built on mutual respect and genuine affection, not obligation or possession. As Flora drifted to sleep in Charlie's wagon, her fingers touched the silver bird pendant at her throat. Like that tiny silver bird, she was truly in flight now, not just fleeing from a cage, but soaring toward a future brighter than she had ever dared to imagine. The remainder of the journey to Montana passed without further incident, though not without challenges. They faced river crossings that tested their skill and courage, steep mountain trails that slowed their progress, and early autumn storms that turned trails to mud and chilled them to the bone. But through it all, the cattle drive pressed on, drawing closer each day to their destination. For Flora, these weeks were a time of transformation. The privileged but unhappy Mrs. Newson of Wallace disappeared completely, replaced by a capable woman who could help with camp chores, tend minor injuries, even assist with herding when an extra hand was needed. Her fair skin tanned from days in the sun, her hands grew calloused from work, and her confidence blossomed with each new skill mastered. And through it all, her relationship with Ethan deepened. True to his word, he courted her with respectful patience, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. They shared conversations around the evening fire, rode side by side when the trail allowed, and stole moments of privacy for increasingly passionate kisses that left them both yearning for more. The men of the cattle drive watched this budding romance with approving eyes. In Flora, they saw not just their boss's sweetheart but a woman who had earned their respect through her courage and determination. In Ethan, they saw a man transformed by love, his natural leadership enhanced by the joy Flora brought to his life. As they crossed into Montana territory, the landscape changed: broader valleys, denser forests, mountains that seemed to touch the sky. And finally, one crisp October morning, they crested a rise to find a spectacular valley spread before them, a river winding through rich grassland, pine forests climbing the surrounding slopes. "There it is," Ethan said, drawing his horse alongside Flora's wagon. "Sutton Valley, our new home." The pride and emotion in his voice brought tears to Flora's eyes. This was his dream made manifest: land of his own, a place to build a future. And now, perhaps, a place for them to build that future together. The cattle drive made its final approach down into the valley, the animals sensing the end of their long journey and moving with renewed energy. As they neared the site Ethan had selected for his ranch headquarters, Flora could see the foundations of what would become their home, a sturdy log cabin halfway built, clearly prepared during an earlier visit. "When did you do this?" she asked in amazement as they drew closer. "Came up last spring with Mac and a few of the boys," Ethan explained. "Wanted to get a head start. It's not much yet, but it's a beginning." "It's perfect," Flora said sincerely, taking in not just the partially built cabin but the entire setting: the clear stream nearby, the sheltered position against a gentle slope, the magnificent view of mountains beyond. The next days were a flurry of activity as the cattle were settled into their new grazing lands and work resumed on the cabin and outbuildings. Most of the cowboys would move on soon, some to other cattle drives, some to nearby towns for the winter, a few to homesteads of their own. But Mac would stay on as foreman, and Charlie had decided to remain as cook, having grown attached to both Ethan and Flora during their journey. One evening, about a week after their arrival, Ethan asked Flora to walk with him to a hilltop overlooking the valley. The sun was setting, painting the landscape in hues of gold and crimson, the air crisp with the promise of winter not far off. "It's beautiful," Flora said as they stood side by side, surveying the land that stretched below them. The cabin was nearly complete now, smoke rising from its stone chimney, cattle dotting the meadows, the beginnings of a proper ranch taking shape. "It is," Ethan agreed, but when she turned to look at him, he was watching her, not the view. "But not as beautiful as you." Flora smiled, still not entirely used to such open admiration. "Flatterer, just honest." Ethan took her hand, his expression growing serious. "Flora, there's something I need to ask you, something I've been thinking about since we left Wallace." Her heart quickened at his tone. "What is it?" "These past months with you have been the happiest of my life," he began, his blue eyes intent on hers. "Traveling together, facing dangers together, building this place together. It's shown me what I want for the rest of my life, who I want to spend it with." Flora's breath caught as Ethan dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hand in his. "I know you're still legally married to Newson," he continued, "but I've had word from a lawyer in Wallace. Given the circumstances, your note, your clear intent to leave, the fact that you've established a new life, Newson has grounds to file for divorce on the basis of abandonment. And according to my source, that's exactly what he's doing. His pride won't let him pursue you, not when it would mean admitting to the town that you preferred a cattleman to a wealthy mine owner." Hope bloomed in Flora's chest. Are you saying I'll be free, truly free? The lawyer believes the divorce will be granted within months, Ethan confirmed. Which means you'll be able to make your own choices about your future, including, his voice grew slightly unsteady, whether you might consider becoming Flora Sutton in more than just our trail disguise. From his pocket, he withdrew a small ring, a simple band of gold with a single pearl set in its center. It's not as fancy as what you're used to, he said apologetically, but it's honest, like what I feel for you. Tears of joy filled Flora's eyes as she looked from the ring to Ethan's face, so full of love and hope and a touch of nervous uncertainty. It's perfect, she whispered. And yes, Ethan Sutton, I would be honored to become your wife, for real this time. Ethan's face lit with such happiness that Flora felt her heart might burst from the joy of knowing she had put that expression there. He slid the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't express. When they finally parted, both breathless and smiling, Ethan kept her close within the circle of his arms. I promise you this, Flora Newson, soon to be Sutton, you will never again be trapped in a loveless home. Our home will be built on respect and partnership, and a love that grows stronger every day. I believe you, Flora said, and she did with every fiber of her being. And I promise to help build that home beside you, to face whatever challenges come our way together, to love you with all that I am for all the days we have. They sealed these promises with another kiss as the last rays of sunset bathed them in golden light, standing on land that would be theirs, looking toward a future they would create together. The winter passed in a whirlwind of activity and anticipation. The cabin was completed just before the first heavy snowfall, providing a snug haven from the Montana winter. Flora threw herself into making it a true home, sewing curtains for the windows, arranging the simple furniture Ethan had crafted, creating a space that reflected not Harold's rigid ideas of propriety, but their own shared vision of comfort and warmth. News from Wallace arrived sporadically via travelers passing through the nearest town. As Ethan's lawyer had predicted, Harold Newson had indeed filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment, apparently eager to put the scandal behind him and focus on his business interests. By spring, word came that the divorce had been granted, leaving Flora truly free for the first time since her father had arranged her marriage. On a perfect June day, with wildflowers carpeting the meadows and the mountains standing as witnesses, Flora and Ethan were married beneath an arch of pine boughs in front of the cabin they had built together. Charlie, Mac, Tommy, and the handful of other cowboys who had returned to work the spring cattle drive stood as their family, cheering as Judge Wilson from the nearby settlement pronounced them husband and wife. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Sutton," the judge said with a smile. Ethan needed no further encouragement, sweeping Flora into an embrace that left no doubt of his feelings, much to the delight and good-natured whistles of their assembled friends. The celebration continued late into the evening, with food and dancing and stories of their journey from Idaho. As twilight deepened, Ethan led Flora away from the festivities to the quiet of the garden she had started behind their cabin. "Happy, Mrs. Sutton?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist as they stood among the newly planted herbs and flowers. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," Flora replied truthfully, leaning back against his solid chest. "Though I still can't quite believe it's real, this place, this life." "You?" Ethan turned her in his arms to face him. "It's real," he assured her, his hands framing her face with tender reverence. "And it's just the beginning." That night, in the privacy of the bedroom they now officially shared, Flora discovered the final freedom Ethan had to offer, the joy of physical love given, and received with genuine tenderness and passion. In his arms, she found not the cold duty she had endured with Harold, but a soaring connection of body and spirit that left her breathless with wonder. "I love you," she whispered in the darkness afterward, curled against his side, her head on his chest where she could hear the steady beating of his heart. "More than I have words to express." Ethan's arms tightened around her, his lips pressing a kiss to her hair. "And I love you, my brave, beautiful Flora. Always will." The years that followed fulfilled the promise of that perfect beginning. Sutton Ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Ethan's knowledge of cattle and business, Flora's organizational skills and growing expertise in gardening and medicinal herbs. The cabin expanded as their needs grew, additional rooms added with the help of the loyal men who worked the ranch. And in the spring of their second year of marriage, their joy became complete with the birth of their son, Samuel, a healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's auburn hair. 2 years later, he was joined by a sister, Elizabeth, named for Ethan's mother. On a warm summer evening 10 years after Flora had first fled from Wallace, she sat on the porch of their now substantial home, watching Ethan teach 8-year-old Samuel to throw a lasso while 6-year-old Elizabeth practiced her reading nearby. The ranch had grown beyond their early dreams, 3,000 acres now, with a reputation for quality beef that brought buyers from as far as Chicago. As she observed her family, contentment washed over Flora like a gentle wave. The trapped, hopeless woman she had once been in Wallace was almost impossible to reconcile with the person she had become, confident, capable, deeply loved and loving in return. Ethan looked up, catching her watching them. His smile, still as powerful as the day they met, sent warmth spreading through her chest. He said something to Samuel, then crossed the yard to join her on the porch, settling beside her on the swing they had built together. "What are you thinking about so seriously, Mrs. Sutton?" he asked, his arm slipping naturally around her shoulders. Flora leaned into his embrace, drawing comfort from his familiar strength. "I was thinking about Wallace," she admitted. "About who I was then and who I am now because of you." Ethan shook his head slightly. "Not because of me," he corrected gently. "Because of your own courage. You chose to leave, Flora. You chose freedom when it was offered. Many wouldn't have been brave enough." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but you were the one who offered that choice when no one else would. Who saw me as a person worth saving. Worth loving," Ethan amended, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Then and now." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching their children play in the golden light of evening. Then Flora turned to her husband, the man who had transformed her life with a simple offer of escape and the promise of a real future. "You remember what you said to me, that day you asked me to come with you to Montana?" Ethan smiled, the memory clearly as vivid for him as it was for her. "I said many things that day." "You told me I deserved happiness," Flora reminded him, her hand finding his. "And you were right. Everyone does. But what I've learned in these years with you is that happiness isn't just something we deserve, it's something we create together day by day." Ethan's eyes, still as blue and clear as the Montana sky, filled with emotion at her words. "Together," he agreed, drawing her closer for a kiss that held the same tenderness and passion as their first, yet deepened by years of shared life and love. As the sun set behind the mountains that had become their home, Flora Sutton knew with absolute certainty that she had found what she once thought impossible: not just escape from a loveless marriage, but a life filled with purpose, joy, and a love that continued to grow with each passing day. The frightened woman who had pressed her forehead against the window in Wallace, watching her husband's carriage disappear down the road, could never have imagined the journey that awaited her. But the woman who now sat in the gathering twilight of Montana, surrounded by the family and home she had helped build, was profoundly grateful for the courage that had led her here, and for the cowboy who had seen in her the strength she hadn't yet recognized in herself.